They get mad at me because I don't prescribe to the ideas of a flipping Earth. For one, because that's always been silly to me, and then two, um, my whole understanding of what a micronova is is not what they're talking about. Nothing close to it, actually.
Right. So there's this guy, Ben Davidson, that I used to follow, and he's got a huge following. He's almost up to 1 million followers. He's wrote textbooks on the sun. Most of his information is relatively good and based on actual science. But in the last few years, he started crowdfunding and getting his followers to buy him an RV, $1 million campground, which is going to be his, you know, retirement fund, because he now has 80 slots at $500 a month, literally taking in tens of thousands of dollars a month.
What's the trailer court's name? Oh, I'm just kidding.
The Death Ranch or whatever it's called, it doesn't matter. But he started to propose this idea of micronova several years ago. Now, the whole nomenclature of micronova has been in the scientific community for longer than he proposed it. But he claims to be the inventor of the word, I believe. But he is not. A micronova is a small, localized, quote unquote, thermonuclear explosion that occurs on the surface of a white dwarf star. Apparently, he didn't even read the definition of what a micronova is. Our star is a yellow dwarf, and based on the fake science, which is the current cosmology we use, in a few billion years, our sun may shrink down and become a white dwarf. But in the meantime, we're a yellow dwarf, so we do not even have micronova as a possibility on our star. And the reason that is pretty simple. Because micronova right here are micronova specifically form on white dwarfs with strong magnetic fields, which is not our sun. You see, because if our sun was a white dwarf with a strong magnetic field, all of the planets in our solar system would have already been sucked into it, and we would all be dead.
Right.
Not only that, here is an artist impression, and this is the only really peer-reviewed paper on the micronova phenomenon. You need a white dwarf star here, which is the big star, and you need a smaller partner star in close proximity, let's say in the orbit of Mercury, and the larger white dwarf is cannibalizing this star. It's literally sucking the material into its photosphere here. And so as that material builds up, it creates an instability in the white dwarf, and then it has to eject the material and go boom. But our star does not fit any of the micronova criteria.
See, I guess the theory is that they were trying to explain away these heavy elements and cosmogenic material 12,800 years ago as this event that doesn't happen on our star.
Well, the funny thing is, Ransom, that we are well aware of an event that happens on our star that's completely unexplainable, and it's the Miyake event. It's an observed sharp enhancement of the production of cosmogenic isotopes by cosmic rays, including beryllium, chlorine-36, and even platinum. How do you like them apples?
All right.
All right, and these events have occurred. We just discovered them using dendrochronology. This is tree rings. And because we have very advanced techniques to look at those tree rings, mass spectrometers and other techniques, and our science is getting better and better, just recently we discovered that our sun does something that's not a micronova. It's called a Miyake event. And maybe a Miyake event can explain some of the cosmogenic things that have occurred in the past, but certainly not the Younger Dryas impact. So our sun doesn't micronova, but our planet does get hit by comets. And we know this because we've proven it at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, which has a platinum and iridium spike and the mass extinction of dinosaurs. And thank God that happened, because you and I wouldn't be doing this podcast.
Right. There'd be no room for us.
So these Miyake events we don't know what they are, but it's certainly the event coming from our sun that we need to look into. The good news is that we've discovered at least 5 of these events in the Holocene: 71, 76 BC, 52, 59 BC. And then we've got the most famous is the Charlemagne event, 774 CE, and a recent one just about 1,020 years ago, the 993, 994 carbon-14 spike. But what's funny is if you lay this over a graph of like humanity or whatever, it doesn't correspond to anything that's deadly or dangerous. Like, it doesn't match up with the plague. It doesn't match up with civilization-ending events. But it may very well explain the millions of petroglyphs worldwide that are all the same, that mimic plasma discharge, that our friend Dr. Anthony Peratt proved in a lab at Los Alamos are exactly these petroglyphs.
Same shape everywhere. Everywhere I've ever been.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't been to Sardinia in the middle of the Atlantic, but the same squatter man is all over the caves there.
Yeah.
All over Europe, all over Africa, Middle East.
Actually,
so go ahead.
Oh, I was going to mention, reading a lot about 536 and that Justinian plague era. There's some cosmogenic evidence in that too. And like, they don't really point to a specific object, but just material raining down. And I was wondering how much that has to do with the possibility of igniting volcanoes, at least electromagnetically.
Well, Lee and I have 2 podcasts on the Justinian plague and the worst year to be alive. And then the first one, what we uncovered on our research, was not a Miyake event, because it's not here. It's not in the tree rings. But guess what happens 1 year before the plague takes hold? There is a platinum spike. And so based on the data, we were like, wait a minute. Oh, what? This is a comet impact right before the plague.
Right.
So you get a comet impact, a very big one, in an area that there weren't a lot of people, because there's no real records of it happening, except for one, I think maybe in Asia, they did see a shooting star. But
right.
then,
Also,
based on, go ahead.
I was going to say they also had reports in Southeast Asia of a super loud sound that carried over way far away from where they were at. So maybe some of the what they thought were volcanoes were this event.
Well, there were volcanoes. So Lolopanga, we've got Iceland erupting at the same time. All this is new science. So it appears, based on what we researched a year ago, is that a comet hit, and then 2 VEI 6-7 volcanoes erupted. Whether it's associated with the impact or the ringing of the earth, increased cosmic rays, it's anybody's guess.
That was my next question, is about maybe the ringing itself is what triggered pressure to release. Because from what I can tell, it seemed like there was more than just 2 giant ones. There was also smaller ones, like in El Salvador and different places like that.
Right. So if you've got volcanoes that are priming to erupt, let's say their magma's building, it's the eruption is a few years off or whatever, but it's building, or even 10 or 20 years off, and then you ring the earth, that type of seismic activity is going to crack existing faults. Let's say Hunga Tonga. We just discussed this, Lee and I, that what happened was a secondary fault caused that eruption. So what I think is going on around the world is a bunch of bad science. But people like clicks, people like to make money, and so even some of the most famous alien encounters, I went out and called these guys out. And many of them are like, yeah, I might have been struck by lightning. So, but they stick with the same story.
Well, they already wrote the book.
Right. So you got to keep selling those books. And Ben Davidson already wrote the textbook. He's got his space weather textbooks in schools, which doesn't have, I don't think, Earth tilting in it. I hope it doesn't. But he has another small pamphlet book for like $20 that talks about his stupid hypothesis, which no scientists in the world support, none of them. The majority of ethical, smart people like myself and my partner Leah, when they look at the data, there's no evidence to suggest that this has ever occurred. The washing of giant things over the ocean. If the Earth were to tilt 45 degrees or more, every single living thing would be eliminated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like they keep pushing this idea of the Earth's rotation slowing down or going in reverse and mixing up those ideas.
No, they're talking about the core reversal. The core reversal is also stupid people not understanding what's happening. The core and the crust basically spin at the same speed. But what has recently happened is the core is now spinning a microsecond slower. So they're all spinning at the same direction and the same speed. The core is just retrograde.
Right.
It's
like
trying
Venus.
Exactly. We're all
it's going in reverse.
It's not going in reverse. It's a millisecond slower than the crust. That's it. So
right. I slowed you down
get your hopes
on your
up.
articles.
What'd you say?
I said I slowed you down on your articles. I'm sorry. Here we go.
No, we're done. We've covered everything.
All right. Yeah, so let me see here. Where do they get this idea? Is it just that Adam and Eve story that they get this from? Or is there something else that is adding to that? Because, you know, there's this concept. I've seen it on Ancient Aliens, all kinds of different things, of this just worldwide massive wave that washed across, and somehow, you know, there was tall enough trees for us humans to stay on land. I mean, obviously there are giant tsunamis in locations, but not to the point where, and this whole idea of the Earth flipping, how did it get back then? I mean, the only thing I could picture is like a rogue planet with enough gravity to tilt the planet. Other than that, I just can't see this scenario happening.
There is an electromagnetic effect that people use to explain this, where they spin an object up in the space station and it rapidly flips, and then it goes back to its original position. But this has nothing to do with the electrodynamics of our solar system. It's just a fancy trick they show to be like, hey, see? Here's the problem. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that object has nowhere near the mass or, you know, energy that's in the Earth. It's a tiny little object. It just no resistance to flip.
Well, and Charles Hapgood's idea of crustal slip and the Adam and Eve story have nothing in common. They're not based on anything scientific. There's no evidence of either of them happening. They're completely two different ideas. Hapgood's crustal slip makes zero sense because we have magnetic data from rocks going back millions, hundreds of millions, billions of years. And we know that the North Pole of Earth has always been the North Pole unless the magnetic field shifts. And so the magnetic field shifting north to south doesn't mean the Earth flips.
Right.
It just means the magnetic field flips. All the evidence suggests that we've always been in this orientation. And what happens is there are slow pulses of crustal displacement. Whether that's due to expanding Earth or plate tectonics is the next argument. but the evidence is pushing towards Earth's expansion theory, not plate tectonics, which means that the Earth was much smaller and we've been growing ever since. And the growth occurs in spurts. And these spurts happen during mass extinction events, which go from one geologic time period to the next. So those major shifts, when all the biome gets mixed up, is due to Earth expansion and a complete reworking of gravity and landmass. So,
right.
Yeah, we're far away from knowing anything. But I can assure you that the Earth doesn't tilt and oceans don't wash over the continent, because I'm a geologist and there's not a single deposit throughout all of sedimentary rock history, which is almost 800 million years, that would show that. We would see a deposit of that and we would know it. And there aren't any.
Not to mention,
maybe Ben should talk to a geologist.
Well, I was just thinking,
scared to death too.
We know nothing like that happened during the history of man, because you would think that, you know, they would document the sky changing that dramatically.
Well, yeah, and Homo sapiens have been here now, we think 315,000, keeps getting pushed back. So if, according to Ben, this happens every 12,000 years, that means that man would have experienced 20 of these Earth tilts and not a single documented representation of one in petroglyphs or in any stories or mythology handed down through time.
No, the stars are the same, and they keep their importance throughout time. So we know it was basically stable throughout all time of humans.
Which is why Hamlet's Mill, written in the 1970s by von Deschen, is the most important piece of literature in our entire scientific nomenclature. It showed that all ancient cultures were aware of the precession of the equinoxes, which means they knew every 26,000 years the Earth is moving through space in a spiral for some reason, and this has been going on forever. There is no way that if the Earth tilts that they would have known that.
Well,
it would have broken up everything. So we've been moving through space in a spiral in perpetuity for hundreds of thousands of years. And this is also corroborated through the Sumerian kings list, for goodness sakes.
Right. I was going to ask you one last thing about that. Do you think that we've been at least documenting the precession of the equinox for 75,000 years? And the reason I say that is because the last 26,000, you wouldn't know that it was a pattern. So you'd have to be watching for 52,000. And to verify it, you would have to have another 26,000 to know that it absolutely repeats the pattern.
Yeah, it's probably, we've been looking at it since we've been us.
Right.
And maybe other hominids have been looking at it as well. It's the only thing without technology that you look at, because once the sun sets, that's all you see. So can you imagine everyone staring up at the sky forever?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we know. That's everything we know. All the stuff that's happened in recent time is mostly bullshit.
That's a good, I think we'll close on that.
Great show.
Thank you for